The key. The key lay on the bottom stair. Small, brass, unremarkable. The sort of key that might open a music box or a jewel case, or the shallow drawer of a writing desk. It lay on the second step from the bottom, against the right-hand edge, as though someone had dropped it while climbing or descending, or had placed it there with a particular and private intention. The carpet on the stairs was good, old, a deep garnet shade worn thin at the centre of each tread from decades of feet. The key had not been there the previous evening. Thomas Wheeler was almost certain of this, almost. He stood at the foot of the staircase and tried not to look at what lay at the bottom of it. Eleanor Crane had been a thin woman in life. Thin wrists, thin voice, thin patience for excuses, and in death she had become somehow thinner still, as though whatever held the shape of her had loosened overnight. She lay on the black and white tiles of the entrance hall, one arm extended towards the morning room door, the other folded beneath her. Her grey cardigan had ridden up. Her feet, in their slippered felt, were bare of any dignity. Tom Wheeler, 24 years old and quite certain he was going to be sick, pressed his back against the wall and breathed through his nose. He had come at 7 to split logs. That was all. 7 o'clock, as arranged, Mrs. Crane had told him herself on Tuesday afternoon, had leaned out from the kitchen garden door and said, "7, Thomas, and don't come round the front." He had come round the front because the side gate was latched from within. He had knocked. The door had swung, unlatched, open an inch. He had pushed it. He had not expected this. The hall was cold, not the ordinary cold of an October morning in the Cotswolds, which Tom had grown up inside and knew the particular weight of, the way it pressed against your collar, the way flagstones held it deep into the afternoon. This was a thinner cold, the cold of a room that had been open to itself all night, breathing in through an unlocked door, settling into corners, into rugs, into the space a body makes when it has not moved for hours. Tom's hand was on the telephone before he understood that he had crossed the hall. He rang the constable's number, the only police number he knew, the one his father kept pinned above the woodshed bench, and stood with the receiver cold against his ear, and heard it ring 4 times before Constable Pike answered. His voice thick with sleep, and said, "Yes." "What is it then?" "It's Tom Wheeler." His voice sounded strange to him. "It's Mrs. Crane. I think she's dead." Silence. Then the sound of something being set down. A mug, perhaps, a solid ceramic sound. "Don't touch anything," said Constable Pike. Tom looked at his hand on the telephone receiver. He looked at the bottom of the stair. He looked at the small brass key lying on the second step from the bottom, and thought, without quite knowing why he thought it, that the key did not belong there. "Right," he said. He did not touch anything. He stood in the cold hall for 22 minutes. He counted them later, to the constable, to the inspector, to anyone who asked, as though the precision of the number might tell in his favour, and looked at the floor and the door and the space above the door where someone had hung a framed needlepoint of the Lord's Prayer. Its letters faded to almost nothing. Almost. Constable Pike arrived at 7:31. He was a large man, slow-moving, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that his size frightens people and tries to compensate for it with gentleness. He took one look at Mrs. Crane and one look at Tom Wheeler and made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. "You found her?" "Yes." "What time did you arrive?" 7. A few minutes past, maybe." "And the door was open?" "Unlatched. I pushed it." "You didn't hear anything, coming up the drive?" Tom thought about this. The drive from the lane gate was perhaps 200 yards, lined with elms. Old elms, the tall October kind, their bark rough as old rope under the hand. He had walked it in the thin early light with his collar turned up, his hands in his pockets, thinking about the stack of logs by the woodshed and whether there was enough kindling left for the week. He had heard a wood pigeon. He had heard his own boots on the gravel. No, he said, nothing. Pike wrote this down in a small notebook. His hand was large and the writing was cramped and careful. He asked 3 more questions. Had Tom gone anywhere else in the house? Had he touched the body? Had he seen anyone on the lane coming in? Tom answered each one truthfully. He had not gone elsewhere. He had not touched the body. He had seen no one on the lane. He did not mention the money. By 9:30, a man from Market Basing arrived in a green car, introduced himself as Inspector Barnaby, late 50s, a tidy grey moustache, the look of a man who has seen a great deal of provincial trouble and is largely unsurprised by it. And the thin October morning had become something different entirely. The ambulance came and went. A woman from a neighbouring house brought biscuits that no one ate. Miss Pringle, Mrs. Crane's companion of 3 years, a pleasant, careful woman with very smooth hands and a talent for appearing wherever she might be most useful, had fainted upon being told the news and recovered in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and was now giving her statement to Constable Pike in the sitting-room in a voice so steady it was almost remarkable. Tom sat on the woodpile in the kitchen garden and waited. The elms along the drive had begun to drop. October did that, laid the year out like a tablecloth being pulled from a table, gradual and then all at once, so that by November there was nothing left but the frame of things. He sat and felt the cold of the woodpile through his jacket, and did not let himself think about the money. Miss Jane Marple arrived in Bramshott-on-the-Wold at 3:20 that afternoon, by the slow train from London that stopped at every station, including 2 that appeared on no map she owned. Hetty Lowndes was waiting at the station in her Morris Minor, older than it should have been, the passenger seat occupied by a tartan rug and 3 library books, and embraced Miss Marple on the platform, with considerably more force than a woman of 67 had any right to. "A murder," said Hetty, before Miss Marple had quite settled her bag. "So I gathered from your letter. Poor old Eleanor Crane, though she wasn't easy, I will say that. A thin mouth, if you follow me, always pressed together, as though she were keeping something back, but she didn't deserve that." Miss Marple, her blue eyes mild and her gloves smooth on her lap, said, "No one deserves that, dear. They've as good as arrested young Tom Wheeler already. He boards with me, you know. Has done for 2 years. He's a good boy, Jane. I know what people will say. He argued with her yesterday over his wages, and there was something about money from the hall table. I haven't quite understood it, but he isn't that kind. I know it as I know anything." The Morris Minor moved through the village at the pace that Hetty had always moved through everything. Steady, unhurried, confident that the road would wait. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She looked out at the October hedgerows, the berries already gone, the hips red and cold in the thin afternoon light. She thought about what Hetty had said, and about the shape a case takes before you can see its shape, and about a young man sitting on a woodpile, waiting to be blamed for something he had not done. For she already felt it, the way you feel a draught before you can name which window is open, "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning." The companion, Margaret Pringle, gave her statement at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, seated in Mrs. Crane's own sitting room, in Mrs. Crane's own armchair, a high-backed thing upholstered in faded yellow silk that had gone rough at the arms. And Inspector Barnaby sat opposite her with his notebook open and his pen uncapped, and the particular expression of a man who is listening carefully and giving very little away. She was a pleasant woman, Miss Pringle. That was the first thing you noticed, and, if you were not careful, the last. Medium height, medium colouring, hair a careful light brown, that might have been helped along by a bottle, though one could not be certain. Her hands folded in her lap were smooth-skinned and pale. She wore a dark navy cardigan over a cream blouse and looked, Constable Pike thought, writing his impressions in the margin of his notebook later, like a woman who had prepared for grief the way one prepares for a church visit. Appropriate clothes, appropriate expression, everything in its right place. She had recovered from her faint completely. "I gave Mrs. Crane her evening medicine at 9:15, she said. "Her heart preparation. Dr. Finch prescribes it. He'll confirm the dosage. 10 drops in a small glass of water." She was sitting up in bed reading when I brought it. We spoke for a few minutes. She mentioned she'd written some letters that afternoon, wanted them posted in the morning, left them on her desk. Then I said good night and went to my own room. "And your room is East Wing, the second door. Mrs. Crane preferred I stay close, in case she needed anything in the night." She paused. Her hands tightened, very slightly on one another. She was frail, you understand. The stairs worried me. I'd said to her more than once that she ought to sleep on the ground floor now. Her age and her heart. But she wouldn't hear of it. Independent woman, proud. Another pause. I was fond of her. Barnaby wrote something, and you heard nothing unusual until 11:23. No hesitation. I know the time because I'd woken. I'm a light sleeper, I always have been, and I'd looked at my bedside clock because I was considering whether to take an aspirin. I get headaches. And then I heard it. A thump, quite loud, louder than I'd have expected, and then nothing. I lay still for a moment. I thought perhaps she'd knocked something from her bedside table. Then I got up and went to her room. Her room was empty. Bed disturbed. She'd been in it, but empty. I went to the top of the stairs and I looked down and She stopped. Her chin lifted very slightly. I saw her. I went down. I knew immediately it was too late, but I checked. Then I rang Constable Pike. Barnaby looked at his notes. The front door, when you came down, was it open or closed? Closed, but unlocked. Mrs. Crane might have gone down herself in the night for some reason. She might have. A thin pause. She did occasionally. Warm milk, or she'd forgotten to lock up. She didn't like to disturb me. And you heard the fall from the east wing? Yes. Clearly enough to know it was significant. Yes. Her smooth hands unfolded and refolded in her lap. Old houses carry sound strangely. Tom Wheeler's statement took 11 minutes. He sat in the kitchen. Barnaby had moved there after the sitting room. And the kitchen was cold, the range not yet lit, the smell of yesterday's cooking, lamb, something with onions, still faint in the air, and answered questions with the trapped patience of someone who understands that the truth sounds worse than a lie, and cannot bring himself to lie. Yes, he had argued with Mrs. Crane on Tuesday. Over his wages, she'd shorted him 3 weeks running, called it an accounting error, and he'd said what he'd said, louder than he should have. The kitchen garden door, 3 o'clock, Mrs. Haskell, the housekeeper, had heard it. Yes, he had been inside the house on Monday. Miss Pringle had asked him to fetch a candlestick from the upstairs landing for polishing. Brass, heavy, one of a pair. And he had carried it down to the kitchen and carried it back up again. No, he had not been in the house on Tuesday evening. Yes, he had touched the banister rail this morning, coming down to the body. Both hands. He had nearly fallen himself, he'd been shaking so badly. Barnaby watched him. Tom Wheeler had the broad, roughened hands of someone who works outdoors, the kind of hands that know the weight and grain of things, wood and stone and cold metal. He held them on the kitchen table as though they were items of evidence he was submitting for inspection. The money he admitted to last, and it cost him something to do it. £3 10 from the dish on the hall table. The dish Mrs. Crane kept small change in for the tradesmen. He'd taken it Monday afternoon. His mother's rent was due, and his wages were 3 weeks short, and he'd meant to return it. He'd been going to return it this week. "From her own house," said Barnaby. "I know what it sounds like." Tom's voice was flat. "It wasn't. I wouldn't have—" He stopped. Tried again. "She owed me more than that." Barnaby wrote something, closed his notebook, looked at Tom Wheeler for a long moment. "Don't go far," he said. Miss Marple heard all of this at 7 o'clock that evening from Hetty Lowndes, who had heard it from Mrs. Haskell's niece, who worked at the chemist's, and had been told by Constable Pike's wife, who had rung 3 people in the village before lunch. By the time it reached Rose Cottage, it had acquired several embellishments: a secret diary, an unknown visitor in a red coat, a love letter, which Miss Marple set aside with the practised ease of long experience. The bones of it, though, the bones were clear enough. She sat in Hetty's front room, with her knitting. She was working on a pair of bed socks in pale grey wool, the needles small and quick in her fingers, and listened to every word, and said very little, and thought a great deal. An old woman, dead at the foot of her stairs. A young man who had argued with her the day before, whose fingerprints were on the banister and on a brass candlestick that had not been where it ought to have been. A taken £3 10. A companion who slept in the east wing and claimed to have heard the fall from there. The east wing. Miss Marple's needles slowed. "Hetty," she said, "which direction does the east wing face?" Hetty, pouring sherry, looked up. "South and east, I suppose. The garden side. Why?" "And the main staircase. That would be the west end of the house." "The front of the house, yes. It's a deep house, Elmwood. Long corridor between the 2 wings." Hetty brought the sherry. "Why does that matter?" "It may not." The needles resumed their rhythm. "I should very much like to meet Thomas Wheeler." Hetty set her glass down. "He'll be in his room, top of the stairs here." She hesitated. A hesitation with a particular texture to it. The hesitation of someone who has been worried for hours and has not quite allowed herself to show it. "Jane, he's a good boy. I've said it, and I'll say it again. He isn't that kind." "I believe you," said Miss Marple quietly. "I should still like to meet him." He came down when Hetty knocked. A tall young man with his father's build, wide through the shoulder. A face that was not quite finished yet, still carrying the last of its boyishness in the jaw and the brow. He had not slept. His eyes had the particular rawness of someone who has spent the day being afraid. He sat at Hetty's kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea he did not drink, and looked at the small, white-haired woman opposite him, with the wary courtesy of the young confronted by the old. "Mrs. Lowndes says you knew Mrs. Crane," he said. "Not well. I knew of her. A mutual friend." Miss Marple considered her knitting, set it aside. "Tell me something, Thomas. The candlestick, the one you carried downstairs on Monday." He stiffened. "I've told the inspector." "Yes, I'm sure you have. Was it heavy?" The question startled him out of his wariness. "The candlestick? Yes. Heavier than you'd think. Old brass, thick at the base." "And warm or cold to the touch?" He thought about this. The genuineness of his thinking was itself a thing to observe, the way he went back to it, the way his hands moved slightly on the table, as though remembering the weight. "Cold," he said. "It had been sitting on the landing, out of the range. Cold all the way through." "And Miss Pringle asked you to carry it down, you said?" "Brought it to the kitchen for polishing," she said. "Mrs. Haskell wasn't well that day, and she was—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. She was managing things herself. Miss Marple looked at him with her mild blue eyes. She thought of a boy in St. Mary Mead, 19 years old, thick-wristed, too honest for his own good, who had been accused of taking tools from the ironmongers, and had been acquitted at the magistrate's court, and had left the village the following month regardless, because acquittal is not the same as being believed. She thought of what happened to young men when the machinery of suspicion got hold of them and turned. She picked up her knitting. "You didn't kill her," she said. It was not a question. Tom Wheeler looked at her. His voice, when it came, was very thin. "No. Good." The needles began again, small and certain. "Then we shall have to make sure everyone else understands that, as well." The hem of the evening. Thursday morning came in grey and close, the sky the colour of old pewter, the air carrying the particular chill of a village that has had a death and has not yet finished processing it. Miss Marple walked the high street at 9:30 with her bag on her arm and her eyes open, which was all she had ever needed. Bramshot on the Wold was the kind of village that looked, on first acquaintance, as though nothing of any consequence had ever happened there. A post office, a chemist's, a butcher's with 3 rabbits in the window. The Crown and Anchor, its sign freshly painted, its doorstep scrubbed. A war memorial with 12 names on it, which was too many for a village this size, and spoke of something that had never quite closed over. The elms along the main road had begun their October shedding in earnest, thin yellow leaves pressed damply to the pavement, to the bonnets of parked cars, to the shoulders of people who had not thought to look up. She bought stamps at the post office. This was not because she needed stamps. The postmistress, a Mrs. Garvey, compact, inquisitive, with the bright, useful eyes of someone who has processed the village's correspondence for 30 years and drawn sensible conclusions from it, required only the mildest encouragement. Eleanor Crane had banked by post, she said, received a good deal of correspondence from London. Solicitors, she thought, though she would not say so directly. Sent registered letters once or twice a year. Kept herself to herself mostly, though she'd been at the Women's Institute until her health prevented it. "And Miss Pringle?" said Miss Marple vaguely, counting her change. Mrs. Garvey's expression shifted, very slightly, the way a tablecloth shifts when someone pulls one corner. Sends her own letters separately. Always has. Strange that. You'd think if you were a companion you'd post together. One would think so, Miss Marple agreed. She bought her stamps and went on. Mrs. Haskell was in the churchyard. She was crouching beside one of the older graves, a Crane ancestor, the stone worn too thin to read properly, collecting the dead flowers from a jam jar someone had placed there. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, the way hands move when they want to appear occupied. She was a broad woman, Mrs. Haskell, with a face that had been handsome once and was now merely solid and dependable, the sort of face that appears in the background of village photographs and is never quite identified. She heard Miss Marple's step on the gravel path and straightened. "Didn't mean to startle you," said Miss Marple. "I'm Jane Marple. I'm staying with Hetty Lowndes this week. I believe you knew Mrs. Crane well." 11 years, said Mrs. Haskell. Her voice was flat. Not unfriendly, simply compressed, like a letter folded too many times. Came when the Colonel died. She needed someone to manage things. And did you manage things well between you? The question was so direct that Mrs. Haskell blinked. Her fingers tightened around the bundle of dead chrysanthemums. "We understood each other," she said after a moment. "She wasn't easy. I won't say she was easy, but she was fair, mostly fair, and she knew the value of 11 years. "Knew," said Miss Marple gently. Something moved across Mrs. Haskell's face. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a woman who has built her daily life around a particular house and a particular routine, and has arrived on Thursday morning to find the scaffolding pulled away. "She was going to let me go," she said unexpectedly. "End of the month. Said she was reorganizing. Miss Pringle had taken on more of the household duties, and she couldn't justify the expense." She looked at the dead chrysanthemums in her hand. 33 years in service, and I was to be reorganized. Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned very early that silence after a confidence is far more productive than a question. "I took some letters," said Mrs. Haskell abruptly. "From her desk, old ones, from the Colonel, private things. I wasn't going to do anything with them, I just—" She stopped, her jaw set. "They weren't Miss Pringle's to go through. After." "No," said Miss Marple. "I quite understand." She left Mrs. Haskell in the churchyard with her dead flowers, and walked on, and thought about a woman who had kept a companion's letters separate at the post office, and an employer's desk locked against a housekeeper who had served 11 years, and the particular domestic geography of a house where one person systematically made themselves indispensable and everyone else unnecessary, like bread rising in a warm kitchen, slow, inevitable, and then suddenly filling all the available space. Dr. Finch arrived at Rose Cottage at 11, not summoned, simply arriving, in the way of village doctors who have made a habit of appearing where something is happening. He was a thin man in his mid-50s, with thin hair oiled flat and thin-framed spectacles, and the kind of professional warmth that sits on the surface of a person like a coat they have not quite grown into. He had come to check on Hetty's rheumatism, he said, her hands, her knees. He asked after her sleep. He stayed for 40 minutes. "Dreadful business," he said, his medical bag closed on his knee, his tea untouched. Eleanor was fragile, of course, her heart. I'd said to Miss Pringle only last month that the stairs were a real concern. "You'd spoken to Miss Pringle about it," said Miss Marple mildly, "rather than to Mrs. Crane herself." A small hesitation. The texture of it was interesting. The way a slightly scorched hem is interesting, only noticeable if you're looking for it. Eleanor could be resistant to advice. It was sometimes easier to go through Margaret. He picked up his tea, set it down. The medication, the appointments. Margaret managed all of that very smoothly. "I imagine she did," said Miss Marple. Something in her tone made him look at her directly for the first time. She was knitting. She smiled at him. The vague, pleasant smile of an elderly lady who has said something she didn't quite mean. He left shortly afterward. "You unsettled him," said Hetty from the doorway. "Did I?" Miss Marple held her knitting to the light. "I thought he unsettled himself. There's a difference." Vivian Crane Ashford arrived on the 2 o'clock train from Paddington. She was 38, with her aunt's thin frame and none of her aunt's compression. She was a woman who had learned to use elegance as a weapon, all sharp angles and careful lacquering, the sort of beauty that declares its own maintenance openly. She came to Rose Cottage on her way to Elmwood. Hetty had been Eleanor's nearest neighbour and oldest acquaintance, and it was the done thing, and sat on the edge of Hetty's best chair and did not quite cry. "I spoke to a solicitor this morning," she said. "On the telephone. There's apparently some question about the will. Aunt Eleanor may have been drafting changes." She touched the pearl button at her collar. "Which of course is neither here nor there now. One simply wants to understand what happened." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Did your aunt mention the changes to you?" Vivian's eyes came to her. The eyes were a pale grey, almost no colour at all, like winter sky. "We weren't close. We kept in touch, but she wasn't. She was a difficult woman, my aunt. Her way or not at all." A pause. The pearl button turned beneath her finger. "I hadn't seen her since April. And yet you came down so quickly." "Of course I came quickly. She's dead." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course," she said, 56 statements. Inspector Barnaby was in the Crown and Anchor on Friday at noon. Not because he drank at noon. He didn't. It was a professional discredit he had always avoided, but because the Crown and Anchor had the warmest room available for an informal conversation, and he had 3 more people to speak to before he could type his report. The landlord had given him the back snug. He sat with a lemonade and his folders and the growing dull certainty of a man who has a case that is too neat. He didn't trust neat cases. He had been a detective inspector for 22 years, in Wiltshire and then in Market Basing. And in 22 years he had learned that neat cases where the evidence assembled itself tidily, where the suspect had motive and means and opportunity all present and accounted for, were sometimes exactly what they appeared to be, and were sometimes something else entirely. The trick was knowing which. Thomas Wheeler. 24. Prints on the banister, prints on the brass candlestick, the one that had been moved from the landing and replaced without adequate explanation. Argued with the victim the afternoon before. Took money from her house. Found the body alone, in a house with an unlocked door, at 7 o'clock in the morning. Barnaby looked at his lemonade. Too neat. Miss Marple appeared at the Crown and Anchor at 12:30. She had, she explained to the inspector, heard that he was the person to speak to. Hetty Lowndes was very worried about young Thomas who boarded with her, and she herself had a small connection to Scotland Yard. Here she produced a name that caused Barnaby to sit slightly straighter. And she wondered, if it were not too much trouble, whether she might look at the statements. Not to interfere. Simply to satisfy an old woman's curiosity. Barnaby looked at her, at the blue eyes, the white hair, the knitting bag on the chair beside her, and made a decision he did not entirely understand. He slid the folder across the table. She read slowly. Her hands were very still in her lap. She had left the knitting in the bag, and her face gave nothing away, which he found oddly more reassuring than if she'd shown him what she was thinking. 3 minutes for Pringle's statement, 90 seconds for Wheeler's, longer for the Reverend Porter's. He noticed that the extra time she gave Porter's statement. Then Vivian's, then Haskell's, then Finch's. She looked up. Miss Pringle said she heard the fall at 11:23, she said. That's correct. From the East Wing bedroom. Yes. And the Reverend Porter states in his account. She touched the paper, one thin finger on the relevant line, that he left Elmwood House at 11 o'clock on Tuesday evening, having called on Mrs. Crane to discuss a parish matter. He left by the side gate, which he says he pulled closed behind him. Barnaby frowned. Porter was there Tuesday evening. He mentioned it. Said they'd argued over a donation she'd withdrawn. Not relevant to the side gate, said Miss Marple, is the gate that Thomas Wheeler found latched from within on Wednesday morning, which is why he came round to the front. The front door was unlocked. She folded her hands. If Reverend Porter pulled the side gate closed from outside at 11 o'clock on Tuesday evening, someone must have opened it again from inside between 11 and Wednesday morning. Or, she paused, someone was still inside the house when he left. Barnaby was quiet for a moment. That doesn't prove no. She picked up her knitting. But it asks a question, doesn't it? And I should like to ask another one, if you'll permit me. The East Wing bedroom, the second door, as Miss Pringle described it. On which side of the house do the windows face? He looked at his notes. A south-facing, garden side. And the main staircase, the front hall, where Mrs. Crane fell, west-facing, quite. He said it before he meant to. He heard himself say it, and sat with it for a moment, turning it over. The way you turn a piece of fabric and find the underside is a different colour entirely. The house is deep. Long corridor. Old houses carry sound strangely, said Miss Marple, and her voice held something that was not quite quotation and not quite irony. So I've been told. She gathered her knitting. She was halfway to the door before she stopped, as though she had just remembered something. Though Barnaby had already begun to understand that Miss Marple did not just remember things. She curated them. One other matter, she said, Miss Pringle's account of the evening medicine. 10 drops at 9:15, she said. You'll want to ask Dr. Finch about the bottle, the current level of liquid remaining. Whether 10 drops taken on Tuesday evening at 9:15 would leave the precise quantity now present. These medicines are very exactly dosed. She smiled. My niece has a similar prescription. One becomes precise about such things. She left. Barnaby sat with his lemonade, which was warm now, and looked at his folder and thought about the side gate and the south-facing windows and a bottle of heart medicine on a bedside table. Too neat. The bottle. Hetty had known Mrs. Haskell for 14 years and had done her a kindness once involving a broken boiler and a spare bedroom. And so it was Hetty who rang on Saturday morning and asked very gently whether 2 old friends might come to pay their respects. Mrs. Haskell said yes. Miss Marple thought she might have said yes to Hetty alone, and was perhaps not entirely pleased to find Miss Marple in the passenger seat of the Morris Minor. But she opened the door all the same, and showed them into the sitting-room, and brought tea on a tray with the automatic competence of a woman whose hands know what to do when the rest of her does not. Elmwood House felt different from the inside than its exterior suggested. The outside was Georgian and certain of itself, good stone, good proportions, the long drive a declaration of established means. But the inside had been lived in too hard and tended too little, the kind of house that has had money in it once, and has since been maintained on the principle that careful preservation is the same as care. The ceilings were high, and the skirting boards were good, but the wallpaper in the hall was lifting at one corner, above the dado rail, and the curtains in the sitting room, heavy green velvet, had faded unevenly, the left panel pulled by years of afternoon sun into something approaching yellow. Miss Marple noticed all of this and said nothing about any of it. They drank their tea. Hetty spoke of Eleanor Crane with the particular warmth of long acquaintance. Not uncritical warmth, but the real kind that knows a person's sharpnesses and accounts for them honestly. Mrs. Haskell listened and occasionally agreed, and once said quietly that Mrs. Crane had been more afraid these last months than she'd shown. "Afraid of what?" Hetty asked. Mrs. Haskell pressed her lips together. "Of losing control of things," she said. "Of finding one day that everything had been arranged for her without her consent." Miss Marple set her teacup down. "I wonder," she said, "whether I might see her room, just briefly, to pay my respects properly, if that doesn't seem a strange request." Mrs. Haskell looked at her steadily. Something passed between them, a recognition of the kind that does not require explanation, the kind that two women of a certain experience arrive at without negotiating the route. "I'll take you up," she said. The room was at the front of the house, west-facing, the windows looking out over the elm drive. A large room, high-ceilinged, with a brass bedstead. That was the 4th time Miss Marple had encountered brass in Elmwood House, and she noted it with the quiet attention she gave to everything, and a turkey rug worn thin at the bedside from the particular pattern of one person getting in and out of bed alone for a great many years. The bedside table held a lamp, a water glass, a folded handkerchief, and the medicine bottle. Miss Marple moved to the bedside table with her hands clasped behind her back, making no move to touch anything. She looked at the bottle. It was dark brown glass with a white label. Dr. Finch's careful handwriting, the dosage in clear black ink, 10 drops in water, evening only. The bottle was 3/4 full. She looked at it for a long moment. The bottle had been dispensed, according to the label, on the 14th of September. This was the 2nd of October. 18 days of use, 10 drops per evening. She was not a chemist. She would be the first to say so, and frequently did, though rather less helplessly than people assumed. But she understood the arithmetic of a regular prescription. The level in the bottle was, to her eye, rather too high for 18 evenings' worth of removal. Notably high, as though fewer doses had been taken than administered, or as though the drops had been counted very carefully for some evenings and not carefully at all for others. She turned. Mrs. Haskell was watching her from the doorway with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite relief. Something between them. The expression of someone who has been carrying a suspicion too large for the available space and has just found a room to put it in. "The medicine," said Miss Marple. "Did you ever watch Miss Pringle give it?" "Twice," said Mrs. Haskell. "Maybe 3 times. She didn't like being observed. Said it unsettled Mrs. Crane. Made her feel managed," she said. Her jaw tightened. Margaret Pringle managed everything, and she did it so pleasantly you couldn't quite object. "No." Miss Marple looked once more at the bottle. At the level of liquid, at the careful handwritten label. "I imagine you couldn't." Margaret Pringle was in the garden when they came downstairs. She was cutting back the late roses along the south wall, deadheading with a pair of garden shears, moving along the border with the steady, methodical rhythm of a woman doing something useful while she thinks. She wore a grey coat and thin leather gloves, pale chamois, very neat, and she did not hear them approach until Miss Marple said quite pleasantly, "What a job you're making of those." Margaret turned. Her face assembled itself in the brief pause between hearing a voice and turning to meet it. Miss Marple noticed the pause. She noticed most things, and she noticed this one particularly. The fraction of a second in which a person's face is unguarded, still wearing its private expression, before the public one is fitted over it. What she saw in that fraction was not grief. "Mrs. Lowndes," said Margaret warmly. Warmth was, evidently, her primary instrument. "How kind of you to come. And I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Jane Marple. I'm staying with Hetty for the week. I wanted to pay my respects to the house. Elmwood always was lovely. I remember Eleanor speaking of the garden in particular." This was not precisely true, but Margaret could not know that. "She loved it," said Margaret. Her smooth hands, the shears held loosely, naturally, moved to a late bud on the nearest stem. "I used to bring her out here on fine afternoons. She couldn't manage much walking toward the end, but she liked to sit and watch the garden work. You must have been such a comfort to her." "I hope so." The pleasantness was inexhaustible. An apron on a peg, always clean, always present, never worn away. It was rewarding work. She was an interesting woman, I'm sure. Miss Marple looked at the garden shears, at the pale chamois gloves, at the smooth hands within them. It must require such particular care. Her heart medicine and so forth, the dosing, the timing. "One becomes very precise," said Margaret without hesitation. "Yes." Miss Marple smiled. "One does." She left it there. She turned and looked at the elm drive and said something pleasant about the October light. And Margaret said something pleasant in return, and they went back inside. Hetty, in the Morris Minor afterwards, said, "You learned something." "Several things," said Miss Marple. She was looking out at the hedgerows, the thin reddened branches, the last of the hips. Her hands were quiet in her lap. "Whether they add up to what I think they add up to, that I shall need one more day, to be certain." Her voice was quiet. But underneath the quietness, if you were listening for it, and Hetty Lowndes had known Jane Marple for 51 years, and was very much listening, was something harder. Something with an edge. What the wind knew Sunday. After church. Cold. The service at St. Bartholomew's was taken by Reverend Porter, a thin, dry man with a thin, dry voice who preached adequately and shook hands at the door with the mechanical warmth of long practice. Miss Marple shook his hand and looked at him directly, and said she'd heard he had been a great support to Mrs. Crane over the years. Porter's hand tightened on hers, very briefly, one small involuntary tightening, the reflex of a man whose conscience has recently been handling something heavier than usual. "I did what I could," he said. "I'm sure you did," said Miss Marple. She walked after church to Elmwood House. Not to the house, not inside. She had no business inside on a Sunday, and would not pretend otherwise. She walked the exterior. The long east wall, the south garden, the corner where the east wing turned away from the main body of the house. She walked slowly, with her bag on her arm, and her coat buttoned to the collar, and she looked at the windows. East wing, second door, south-facing. She stood at the southeast corner of the house and looked at the distance between the east wing windows and the front entrance, the front hall, the staircase, the black and white tiles where Eleanor Crane had lain. The house was deep. The corridor between the wings was long and stone-floored, and she had noted on Saturday, lined with thick curtains at its single window. A thin-walled modern house might carry sound unexpectedly. Elmwood was not thin-walled. Elmwood was 18-inch stone construction. She pressed her palm flat against the exterior wall. Cold, cold all the way through, the deep cold of old stone that has been absorbing Cotswold winters for 2 centuries. She stood there with her hand on the wall. Then she looked up at the weather vane on the church tower, visible above the elm line. North-northeast. That was the direction it sat today. She had checked the Reverend Porter's garden journal. Hetty had asked him, at coffee after the morning service, what the weather had been Tuesday night. And Porter, who was a methodical recorder of such things as though Providence required documentation, had said, north-northeast wind, considerable. He'd mentioned it, had rattled his study window most of the night. North-northeast. The east wing's south-facing windows would have had that wind full against them. Not a gentle pressure. A driving October wind against 18-inch stone, and behind that stone, a sleeping woman who claimed to have heard through all of it, through stone and corridor and curtained passage, a fall at the far end of the house. At exactly 11:23. Miss Marple lowered her hand from the wall. The cold of the stone stayed on her palm. She could feel the print of it, the rough grain of the surface, the weight of what she knew pressed as solidly as masonry against the inside of her chest. Not a puzzle now, not a question. An answer, hard-edged and clear, that had been present since Wednesday evening and had only needed the right light to read it by. She was angry. Not the loud kind of anger, she had never been given to that, but the still kind, the kind that doesn't require expression because it has already decided on action. A boy of 24, roughened hands on a kitchen table, his honest face raw with fear. A woman with a smooth, pleasant face and pale chamois gloves, cutting back roses she would never have troubled to cut if Eleanor Crane had been alive to see the garden. £3 10 taken from a dish. A bottle of medicine, a fraction too full. An innocent boy's life, waiting to be ruined. She would not allow it. She walked back to Rose Cottage with her bag on her arm, and her coat buttoned, and the north-northeast wind at her back, and she went to Hetty's writing desk and took out 2 sheets of paper and wrote a letter to Inspector Barnaby, precise, detailed, every contradiction laid out in order, the medicine, the acoustics, the side gate, the gloves, the pattern Margaret Pringle had stitched so carefully over 3 years, one small thread at a time, until it covered everything. She sealed the envelope. She would deliver it herself in the morning, Monday, and she would sit with him and make him understand, and she would not leave until he did. She picked up her knitting. The needles moved, clicked, stopped, started again. The brass candlestick. Inspector Barnaby read the letter at his kitchen table on Monday morning before he had finished his breakfast, and arrived at Rose Cottage at 9 o'clock with his coat still buttoned wrong, and a look on his face that was not quite convinced, but was no longer not quite convinced either, which Miss Marple understood to be progress. She had made tea. She poured it. She let him read the letter again. He did, in fact, read it again, which she took as a promising sign. And then she set down her cup and began. The medicine first, she said. 18 days of the prescription, at 10 drops per evening, against the level remaining in the bottle. You'll need your pharmacist to confirm the arithmetic precisely. I am not a chemist, but the level is wrong, Inspector. Too high. Either the doses were not given as recorded, or they were given inconsistently over time in a very particular way. a way that would make an elderly woman's heart condition less stable, more likely to produce an incident. Barnaby's pen moved. He said nothing. The candlestick. Miss Pringle asked Thomas Wheeler to carry it down on Monday, 2 days before the murder. She asked him specifically. He handled it with both hands. She had it back in the kitchen, ostensibly for polishing. Miss Marple's voice was even, careful, a seam being stitched with very small stitches. His fingerprints would have transferred clearly to the brass. A cloth would remove Miss Pringle's. A cloth leaves no print of its own. She set up the print in advance, said Barnaby. She planned this for some time. Mrs. Crane had confronted her. We don't know precisely when, but it was recent. The letter to the solicitor was written and ready to post. Margaret Pringle knew the letter existed. She had to act, and she had to have someone else standing in the light when she did. Wheeler's argument with Mrs. Crane on Tuesday was, I suspect, known to Miss Pringle in advance. She may even have encouraged it. A small interference here, a misdelivered message there. Thomas Wheeler is a young man with a temper and a legitimate grievance. She needed him visible and audible and angry 24 hours before. Barnaby put his pen down. He picked it up again. The acoustic evidence is impossible, said Miss Marple. And for a moment the pleasantness left her voice entirely, not harshly, but with the quiet finality of a door being firmly closed. I have stood at the southeast corner of Elmwood House with my hand on the wall. I have measured with my eye the distance from those south-facing windows to the front hall. 18-inch stone construction, a long interior corridor, a driving north-northeast wind off the church tower that night, and she heard a fall at precisely 11:23. She looked at him steadily. She knew the time because she caused the fall, Inspector. She knew the sound because she was there when it was made. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a cart horse moved slowly up the lane. She could hear the particular drag of its feet on the damp road, the clink of the harness. A wood pigeon somewhere. The ordinary sounds of a Monday morning, sitting around a conversation that was not ordinary at all. Barnaby said, "The side gate." The Reverend Porter pulled it closed from outside at 11 o'clock. Someone opened it again from inside between then and Wednesday morning. Thomas Wheeler found it latched from within at 7. If Wheeler had gone back to the house in the night, he could not have latched the gate from inside and also been on the outside of it. The gate cannot be latched from both sides simultaneously. She folded her hands. It was latched from inside because someone was inside and remained inside all night. Another silence, longer. Then Barnaby picked up the letter, folded it once, and put it in his breast pocket. He finished his tea standing up. "I'll want the pharmacist," he said, "and I'll want to search her room." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "you will." The letter never posted. They found it at 11:20. Barnaby had brought Constable Pike, who was large and careful, and moved through Margaret Pringle's room with the conscientious delicacy of a man who respects the law's requirements and his own size in equal measure. The room was tidy, extraordinarily tidy, the tidiness of a person who controls their environment because controlling environments is what they do. The wardrobe arranged by colour, the cosmetics on the dressing table aligned, every surface clean, every drawer closed. The letter was in the lining of a winter coat, not hidden exactly, not sewn in, not taped, simply placed there, in the inner breast pocket of a heavy wool coat pushed to the back of the wardrobe behind 2 others, as though it had been put somewhere quickly and moved there only temporarily. And temporarily had become permanent because there was no safe way to destroy it without being certain it had been opened. and no safe way to know that without knowing what Mrs. Crane had said to the solicitor by telephone in the days before. It was 3 pages in Eleanor Crane's thin, cramped handwriting. Miss Marple did not read it. She was not in the room when it was found, having remained in the corridor with Hetty, who had insisted on coming and was now leaning against the wall with her eyes closed and her hands clasped. But Barnaby summarized it afterward in the sitting room, with a brevity that contained a great deal. Mrs. Crane had known for 6 weeks. She had discovered a discrepancy in the household accounts, had begun to look more closely, and had found, methodically, over the following month, that small sums had been removed from various sources over 3 years. Not large amounts individually, cumulatively significant. She had also discovered, from a question she had put quietly to Dr. Finch, that her prescription dosage had been recorded differently than the drops she was actually receiving. She had written the letter to her solicitor outlining a revised will. She had not, in the end, posted it, or she had posted it and it had not arrived. Or, Margaret Pringle, when Barnaby came downstairs with the letter in a paper evidence envelope, was sitting in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold. She had been sitting there since Barnaby's arrival. She had not asked questions, she had not protested. She looked at the envelope. Her face, for one moment, one long moment, was entirely true. It was not the face of a monster. That was the thing about it that would stay with Miss Marple afterward, that she would turn over in quiet evenings for some time to come. It was the face of a woman who had wanted something very much, and had decided that the wanting justified the method, and had been wrong, and knew it, and had known it perhaps for some time, was perhaps tired of carrying the knowing, tired of the pleasantness, tired of the smooth hands and the correct expression, and the careful management of every room she entered. She said nothing. She put on her coat when asked. She picked up her gloves from the kitchen table, the pale chamois ones, and held them for a moment, and then set them back down. She went with Barnaby quietly. The key. Again Tom Wheeler came back to Rose Cottage at 6 o'clock that evening. Hetty cried. She was not a woman given to crying. 51 years of friendship had taught Miss Marple that Hetty Lowndes expressed most emotions as strong opinions, but she cried now, briefly and thoroughly, with Tom's broad, awkward hand patting her shoulder, and his own eyes not entirely dry. He sat afterward at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He drank this one, and looked across at Miss Marple with the particular expression of someone who has been through a door they did not expect to come back through. "How did you know?" he said. Miss Marple considered. Outside, the October dark had come down early, the way it does in the Cotswolds, not gradually, but in a single settling, as though the light has made a decision. The kitchen was warm. Hetty's cat, a large, opinionated tabby named after a cabinet minister, occupied the chair nearest the range. "It reminded me," said Miss Marple, "of a woman in St. Mary Mead, a nurse named Ellis. A very pleasant woman, dear. That was the trouble. She was so very pleasant that no one thought to look behind it. She had been with her patient for 4 years, and managed everything beautifully. And when the patient died, she had been named in the will. And there was some question about the medication. But the question wasn't asked loudly enough, and by the time it was asked at all, she had gone elsewhere." She paused. Her hands moved the teacup in small, absent circles. I have always rather regretted that I didn't speak up sooner. One thinks, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it's uncharitable. And while one thinks, someone is being blamed for something they didn't do." Tom was quiet for a moment. "The money I took," he said. "Was wrong," said Miss Marple simply, "and you know it, and that will be between you and your conscience for some time. But stealing £3, 10 shillings, and committing murder are separated by a considerable distance, and the law is required to know the difference." She looked at him directly. "Make sure you pay it back." "Yes," he said, "I will." She believed him. There were questions that were not answered, and Miss Marple was honest enough with herself to know they would not be. Mrs. Haskell's bundle of letters, what they contained, whether they would stay contained, remained her own affair. Dr. Finch and his arrangement with the chemist in the next town would surface or not surface as such things did in their own time, in their own way. Vivian Crane Ashford had caught the Wednesday train back to London, looking neither relieved nor disappointed, which was perhaps the most honest expression she had managed all week. The Reverend Porter had been at Elmwood on Tuesday evening, and had not said so clearly. Miss Marple suspected he had gone to ask Eleanor Crane to reconsider the withdrawn donation, and had been refused, and had left with his disappointment and his side-gate, and his guilt that he had been there and had not known, or had not asked himself whether he knew, that something was wrong in that house. These things sat with her. Humans leave some questions open. That, she had always thought, was because life does. Inspector Barnaby came to Rose Cottage on Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after Miss Marple's arrival, the circle of a week completed, with his coat buttoned correctly and a small object in his hand. He stood in the doorway and held it out to her, the brass key. "Evidence logs closed," he said. "Found at the scene. No established purpose. No one's claimed it." Miss Marple looked at it lying in his palm. Small, cold, the key to Eleanor Crane's writing desk, from which the desk's contents had been quietly managed for 3 years, by a woman with smooth hands and inexhaustible pleasantness. She picked it up, felt the weight of it, lighter than you'd think for something that had held so much. "I'll return it to the house," she said. She walked to Elmwood that afternoon alone, with her bag and her coat and the key in her gloved hand. Mrs. Haskell let her in without asking why she had come. She went upstairs, past the garnet stair carpet, past the second step from the bottom where the key had lain, and along the corridor to the writing desk in the study. She put the key in the lock, turned it. The drawer opened smoothly. Empty now, the police had taken what was in it, and the letters Mrs. Haskell had taken were somewhere else entirely. But the mechanism worked, and the brass was solid, and the desk was still Eleanor Crane's desk. She locked it again, left the key inside the lock where it belonged, walked home through the elm drive, the last of the October leaves releasing overhead, thin and yellow settling on her coat, on the gravel, on the quiet road that led back to the village. She did not look back at the house. End.